Marc LiVecche, welcome to the Fearless Project podcast. We're glad to have you back. For those who might not have seen your last episode with us, maybe a quick introduction, your background, who you are.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. This is an important conversation. I'm excited to be talking about it. I am Marc LiVecche. As you said, I'm the McDonald, I can never remember my title, I'm the McDonald Distinguished Scholar for War, Ethics, and Public Life, or something like that, at Providence, which is a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And I'm also a non-resident research fellow up at the US Naval War College. And I suppose I should probably say that anything I do say in this podcast is my opinion alone, although I think it should be shared by everyone.
Well, thank you. We're so excited to have a distinguished guest such as yourself unpack kind of just war theory, which you write a lot about on Providence. So I'll direct the audience through some links as well to your written work. But we'll just jump right out of the gate. We're going to be talking about just war theory, what that means in the Israel-Hamas war. So from a just war theory framework, when is it moral and when is there a clear imperative to fight or use force? In other words, when is war the righteous option?
All right. It's a good question, and I actually appreciate the way you've framed it. I'll explain why in just a moment. So, as you say, just war is a moral framework for establishing when it is right to fight. And then secondly, now that you know it's right to fight, how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? And so it's traditionally broken into two bits. Both are given fancy Latin names. The first is the jus ad bellum, right? When is it right to fight? And then the second is the jus in bello. How do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight? When is it right to fight? It becomes a question of whether or not you have a proper authority who can lead his or her or its, if it happens to be a system with more than one ruler. But you need a political authority who has the responsibility for the care of the political community, for establishing and maintaining things like justice, order, and peace, basic political goods. That person and that person alone, because they have the duty to provide those things, also has the commensurate responsibility to provide those things. Nobody else can do it. Now, there are different exceptions in case the sovereign has unsovereigned themselves, if they've become tyrannical, things like that. There's accommodations that are made for that. But by and large, you need a proper authority. And then most obviously, you need a justifying cause. Doesn't matter if you're the proper authority. You can't just decide willy-nilly that you're going to invade another country. You can't do it to provide them with material goods. It may be true that if we attack this primitive nation and bring them Netflix and Tupperware, their lives will be better. But that's not a justifying cause to fight. So you need a justifying cause. And classically, and when I say classically, I mean within the classical Christian understanding of justified war, there are three justifying causes. The first is the protection of the innocent. The second is to take back things that have been wrongly taken. And then the third is to punish evil. And those alone are the three justifying causes for going to war. And then third, you need a proper intention. You can't use justifying causes as an excuse to take over another nation or to seize more territory or to enrich your treasury. The proper intent in the first place should be the rescue of the innocent, the requiting of the injustice or the punishing of the evil. But in the second instant, the proper end of a justified war is peace, ideally with your adversary, though the adversary always has a vote, so peace might be a bridge too far. But you should fight in such a way that your ambition ultimately is reconciliation. So those are the three justifying causes. And the reason I say I liked how you phrased the question is you asked when it is an imperative. And for some people, they will say the just war tradition and the jus ad bellum criteria gives you permission to fight. I usually say it's stronger. If you're a sovereign authority who's identified a justifying cause and you have a right intent, then you don't have permission to fight. You have an obligation to fight. Presuming several other things are now in place, and these then get into what are sometimes called the prudential criteria, the just war jus ad bellum framework. And these are things like, is it the last resort? So you might have a justified cause, and you might have the right intent of overturning that justifying cause and having peace. But is there something else you can do? Can you talk first? Can you use other less lethal means than war? So is it the last resort? Are you going to achieve more good by going to war than by not going to war? And the converse is true. Would you achieve more good by not going to war than by going to war? And then do you have any real chance of succeeding in this thing? If it's likely that all you're going to do is kill people and break things, and you have no real chance of overturning the justifying causes, then prudence, not duty, but prudence might suggest you don't do it. So the reason I like your use of the word imperative is the just war says there is something wrong. It's got to get fixed. And then it does say wisdom might dictate otherwise. But if you can do it, and if it needs to be done, then it's typically a moral obligation, not simply a set of permissions.
And if I'm correct in understanding, would applying this to this conflict, the jus ad bellum would be October 7th, and then the larger call of Islamism and Hamas for the total destruction of Israel. Would that be a correct application of that?
That would be a correct application in a fairly slam dunk case, in my estimation, of a justifying cause. They mean to drive you into the ocean.
And that kind of leads into my next question: is the biggest argument against Israel's right to self-defense after October 7th has been that it's not a proportionate response. And I'm not unclear what people mean by proportionality, if they meant that the IDF come in and do exactly what Hamas did, which would have been inhumane and an actual act of intended genocide, if we look at what the term genocide means. So if we can maybe unpack or highlight what proportionate warfare means, like what is proportionality at its core, and is Israel responding proportionately?
Yeah, great. Grotesquely misunderstood term in a lot of instances. If you have the ears to hear, then you heard in my description of the jus ad bellum, when is it right to fight, you would have heard me give a little bit of a definition of proportionality, right? So when I said, is it likely that this war will yield more good than harm? That's a proportionality calculus. So in the first instance, proportionality plays a role in the jus ad bellum. Will going to war likely do more good than harm? Will not going to war more likely do more harm than good, right? Proportionality works both ways. And that links a little, or that links not a little bit, it links concretely to the intended aim. So I've already said the intended aim is peace, but there's also a primary, more self-evident reason for going to war, and that's to win that war. So a part of the war aim, the proper war aim, is to win. Because if a war is right to fight, it's right to win it. And so then the question becomes, will fighting this war in such a way as to win it yield more good than harm? All right, so that's the proportionality calculus in the jus ad bellum. And then I had said that the just war tradition has a second set of categories, the jus in bello, or how do you rightly fight the fight that's right to fight. And there you find three categories. Typically you find two. You find proportionality and discrimination. Some of us have been adding a third that's always been tacitly there, which is necessity. And so this takes us down from the strategic level down to the tactical, sort of on the ground level. Any activity you do within war ought to be necessary. Necessary for what? Well, necessary for achieving the end. Well, what's the end? The end is victory. This is just a matter of stewardship. War always costs men and equipment. You kill people, you break things, you send people to die, things like this. So it's a question of stewardship. And then you get to the question of proportionality. And some people will say that proportionality is as you've described it. If they kill 10, we kill 10. And then that gets grotesque really quickly because, well, what if they've raped and assaulted 10? What does proportionality suggest then? So obviously, that can't be right. Proportionality can't be that. And so proportionality becomes a question, even at the tactical level, of is this battlefield action likely to do more good than harm? And it's not weighed against itself. So it might be that if I take out bad guy A, and it's going to cost, in all likelihood, 20 civilian lives for me to take the strike. In one sense, you look at that calculation and you think, well, one bad guy can't possibly be worth the lives of 20 good people. But you have to weigh all of that against the ambition of, the aim of the war itself. So in this case, the ambition is the elimination of Hamas and all the good things that will come with that. Good things not just for Israelis, but for Palestinians, for the Middle East, for Gaza very specifically, for the wider world. And so these kinds of calculations, proportionality calculations, are made first against the war aim. And And then against the question of discrimination, which says that you ought to target only those who mean you harm, so fighters, combatants, and you should never intentionally target non-combatants. And the word intentionally does an awful lot of work. If you want, we can discuss that. All set against this idea of necessity. So there are times where taking out the particular bad guy at the cost of 20 people in this moment might not be critical. So maybe we can wait. And there are technologies that happily have allowed us to do that. So proportionality is complex, but it's weight against war aim, and then and the goods that will come from achieving that aim versus the goods that will come from not achieving that aim. And on that kind of a calculation, I think Israel has been fighting, and I recognize that to some listeners this might sound crazy, but they've been fighting with an enormous amount of restraint and an enormous amount of proportionality. And that's grotesque, right? But this is what proportionality looks like when you have a military group that is sewing itself within the fabric of civilian communities.
I really want to touch on that and unpack a few things. So you mentioned restraint, which goes against the popular narrative of Israel's policy of genocide in Gaza, which would be the opposite of restraint. And you also hit on something that I think is fundamentally uncomfortable about this war and why so many people excuse it as genocide, which is the distinction between civilian and combatant. There's also the really uncomfortable reality that that line is very hard to distinguish in Gaza. How should we think about urban warfare, and why is it important not to conflate genocide with conventional war, which aims might lead to urban centers where civilians are unintentionally casualties in the conflict?
Yeah, right. So yeah, I mean, just first things first. I mean, things ought to be called what they are, and no good comes from calling something that it's not. And so, genocide is a very particular thing. We don't get to call something genocide simply because we don't like it. We don't get to call something genocide simply because it's grotesque. We don't get to call something genocide simply because it cost a lot of lives, right? Genocide, there's a convention that was put together in 1948 in order to give language to what had occurred in the Second World War. And so genocide becomes a very specific thing, which is, I'm not going to get this exactly right, but it's something like the intentional will to destroy a national, an ethnic, a religious, or I guess a racial group, right? So intent is very important. Intent is also complicated because how do you establish whether or not somebody really has the intent to do something? Well, one of the things you can do is you can look at the actions that are manifest on the battlefield or in the particular situation. And so if you look at the actions that are manifest on the battlefield, if you look at how the IDF has conducted this war, again, this might sound like crazy talk to some people, but there's back up just a second. There's a grotesque sort of macabre ratio that we sometimes use to describe civilian casualties, and it's a civilian casualty ratio. So the number of combatants, or the number of civilians that are killed for every combatant that you kill. And again, these numbers can be incredibly politicized, and they're all over the map. And one of the problems, just as an aside, for being able to think ethically about something like the IDF war against Hamas is, that there's a lot of bad actors in the media. There's misinformation. It's very difficult on both sides to get accurate information. But as of February, I think the numbers that the Palestinian authorities have claimed being killed are something just above 30,000 Palestinians. The IDF claims that of those 30,000, about 13,000, I think, have been Hamas fighters. And so if we just accept those numbers as maybe roughly true, they're both probably high, right? They both have built-in incentives for juicing the numbers. But if we accept them as they are, and then you do other things like calculate the number of expected deaths that would have died anyway in Palestine, because even during a war, people die of natural causes. Then you factor in the number of people that Hamas has probably killed through accidental failings of weapon systems through intention. They did gun down some of their own people when those people were following IDF orders to evacuate and things. So you crunch all these different numbers, and it seems reasonable to assume a casualty rate of about 1-to-1, just over one civilian has been killed for every combatant. That's horrible, but in terms of warfare, historically, that's about the norm. And then you consider, as you've pointed out, urban warfare. And historically, urban warfare tends to kill about 90% civilians, right? About 10% turn out to be fighters. And if that's the historic norm for urban warfare, then the IDF has come astonishingly low on that percentage. And if that's the case, then to suggest that the IDF is so incompetent in its efforts at genocide that it can't even kill a proper number of people just puts absurdity to the suggestion that this is an act of genocide. You can identify intent through action, and Israel is doing a miserable job of killing all of the Palestinians if genocide is actually their intent.
And another kind of, this bleeds into that as well, is this idea that this is a asymmetric war that's kind of also used to delegitimize Israel's campaign. What is asymmetric warfare? And then we also have this complex kind of component or consideration that Hamas is a terrorist organization, which would normally be considered a non-state actor, but they also have ruled Gaza since 2005, or since the 2006-7 elections. So they serve a governmental role as well. So those lines are also very blurred. So what is asymmetry, and why do you think people use it to delegitimize Israel in this cultural and conversational narrative?
Yeah, because it works, right? That's the easy answer. Why does it work? That's the more complicated answer. So, okay, so factual questions first, right? So an asymmetrical war is war between, two or more belligerents whose military capabilities are not simply unequal, but they're so unequal that they can't actually both harm one another in exactly the same ways, right? And so because the weaker power can't harm the stronger power, the more conventional power in most cases, in open warfare, then they have to resort to tactics that allow them to continue a fight. And so typically then in an asymmetrical fight, you get the weaker force using guerrilla tactics, um, hiding among the civilian population, hit and run tactics, terrorism, things like this, right? Insurgencies, things like that, and their aim is, to try to erode the political and the social will of the stronger power to continue fighting, and that's typically the way that a guerrilla movement, an asymmetrical fight, can be won. On the surface, it would seem that it's always to your advantage to be the powerful army rather than the weaker army, and I think most people would agree. I'd rather be the powerful one. But history is full, of course, of examples. And we've walked into a number of them ourselves in which the stronger power does not, in fact, win. Henry Kissinger had a quip that when something like, all that's necessary for the guerrilla to win is for him to not lose. But the conventional power loses if he does not win. Right. And so, even the terms of what victory look like are themselves ironically asymmetrical, and in this case fall in favor of the weaker power. I think the reason that people utilize asymmetrical warfare, as I've always considered it simply a fact. This is simply, a factual statement, but now it's become a moral statement that is an asymmetrical fight, as you've pointed out. And I think that has a lot to do with Western discomfort with power. Even and maybe especially sometimes within Christian communities, we think power is a bad thing, which is profoundly bizarre. But we distrust power. We distrust the deployment of power. We especially distrust it when power is used against perceived weaker opponents, especially when power is used against perceived weaker opponents for the sake of our own interests. Right? If we expend power in favor of somebody else, that's okay. But we've really become allergic to power, and power's become a bad thing, right? And so I think that's partly how you win that narrative. You have the bully, and then you have the bullied, and the West is increasingly on the side of the perceived bullied.
And do you think Hamas is in it is in the weaker position as far as capabilities or conventional military capabilities, but what are some advantages that Hamas benefits from in this war that Israel can't?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the moral narrative, the popularly understood moral narrative. It is genuinely difficult for me to inhabit the view that Hamas is somehow, I'm gonna retract what I'm gonna say in just a moment, but it's hard for me to inhabit the view that Hamas is somehow the good guy or the victim here. The retraction is this: that I think even on the campus protests, and here I think I'm giving them a huge degree of benefit of the doubt. I'm not sure that they're saying Hamas is the victim or the the good guys. They're trying to say, well, the Palestinian people are. But a lot of the rhetoric and a lot of the imagery makes that very confused, because you see the Hamas, insignia and flags and all the rest, and they'll use the same language of from the river to the sea, occupied lands, open air prison, and all the rest. So it becomes very, very confused very quickly. So winning the moral narrative for sure. And then simply the fact, like Kissinger's insight that it's going to be it's an incredibly heavy lift for Israel to get its war aim, which is the elimination of the possibility of Hamas ever posing a threat to them again, which is going to mean both politically and militarily delegitimizing Hamas. Delegitimizing them militarily might be somewhat easier, but removing them as the dominant political force within Gaza is going to be tricky because, as you pointed out, they are a classical non-state actor. However, they behave an awful lot like a government. We forget that Palestine is actually partially recognized as a state by over 140 some odd UN member states. But the Palestinian state that's recognized has the Palestinian Authority as its government, not Hamas. And so Hamas, I think, under any terms, is a non-state actor that behaves, when you look at how they fight, an awful lot like a terrorist non-state actor. And yet they govern and they enjoy, again, these numbers are political on both sides, but they appear to enjoy an enormous amount of public support within Gaza. And I know that's controversial and goes back and forth, and I hear different numbers, and you would know better than I do. So they're complex, but I think every time a civilian is killed in Gaza, Hamas wins. They benefit from Palestinian dead, which is, I think, partly or largely why they are sowing themselves within Palestinian society, fighting among civilian populations, fighting from mosques, fighting from schools, and all the rest. They benefit when Palestinians die. And that's grotesque. Israel cares more about Palestinian civilians than Hamas ever has.
And that's like the most unfortunate part of this cultural narrative is that those people get lost in that. I would love to talk about Israel's aims militarily and then maybe morally or ideologically. So from a military perspective, Rafah has been an important piece in this aim or objective. What are some of the aims of going into Rafah, right? Because the international community will have you think it's to kill 1.5 innocent Palestinians who fled the north to the south. But there are real military aims there. One of them kind of pointing to that asymmetry, a complex network of underground tunnels, infrastructure embedded in civilian infrastructure. So what are those military aims? And then I'd love to unpack how the US and the Biden administration has responded to it.
Yeah, sure. So as I understand it, from the beginning, they said, as they started the fight in the north, Hamas naturally probably already had some military assets in the south. Certainly some more of them had fled to the south after the fight in the north started going poorly. And so Israel said that the last remaining significant battalions of Hamas fighters are in Rafah. I think I can't remember now if the number was 4 battalions or what, but the last remaining fighting strength of Hamas as a military organization was in and under Rafah. So militarily, they need to be destroyed. You need to destroy their ability to prosecute the war further and to harm Israel. So militarily, that was the aim. And then to delegitimize Hamas politically, in order, seizing Rafah would give Israel control of the crossings to Egypt, which means they could then control the flow of men and equipment, including humanitarian aid into Gaza. And so, the aspiration would have been destroy Hamas militarily as a fighting force, eliminate them, seize control of the major crossings, eliminate the tunnel infrastructure, and thereby the IDF temporarily, that's important to note, the IDF temporarily and not Hamas control the crossings into Gaza. And so then, therefore, the IDF can begin to control the flow of humanitarian aid. And all of that taken together delegitimizes Hamas as the dominant political power in Gaza, which is just a absolute unalloyed good for the Palestinian people. And so those two things should have been the aim, right? The destruction of Hamas militarily and politically, and then hopefully a turnover to some sort of government that begins to further erode Hamas's hold on the Palestinian mind. Hamas doesn't have to lead Gaza. That needs to be made clear to the Palestinian people. They need to have a vision for something after Hamas that has their best interests in mind.
And unfortunately, I don't know if the Biden administration, at least their stated policy in the statements coming out of the White House, doesn't seem to agree or see the benefit of this hoped outcome for the Rafah offense. The Biden administration has withheld critical military equipment for the offensive, breaking with a huge kind of status quo tradition of the U.S.-Israeli alliance. So what are the real life ramifications of the Biden administration's policy, and how does it undermine their claim that this is for humanitarian reasons? You've mentioned, a death for Hamas, or Hamas staying in power is really the bigger humanitarian crisis. So I guess overall thoughts on what the Biden administration has gotten wrong about Rafah.
You got a minute? I mean, you start with their claim that 1.5 million people were in jeopardy. And of course they were. Okay, they're in jeopardy. And so the IDF, Israel, now needs to do something about that jeopardy. And the Biden administration, I'm sure this is an exaggeration, but it seemed to me like on a Monday, say, the Biden administration said it's impossible to get 1.5 million people out of Rafah, out of harm's way. And then like by Friday, like 970,000 some odd refugees had been moved to at least relatively safe areas, right? The IDF had accomplished what apparently, 5 days before it was impossible. So they did it. So good on them, right? And I don't think you can go through history and find an awful lot of examples of nations that have done that. The United States attempted to do that in Fallujah. Israel's done it here. It's one sign of a moral military when they intentionally try to get civilians out of the way, a great risk to themselves. That's not a painless operation. It puts a pause to the fighting. It lets Hamas do all sorts of things in the lull. It's not to your strategic military advantage to do such things. I mean, there's other advantages that they gain from that, of course. So Biden's administration was wrong about that. They said that you can't crush an ideology like Hamas through military operations. Again, history, and we could get into more detail, but history is replete with examples of actually crushing ideologies with military operations. Now, had they said you can't crush ideologies with military operations alone, then we'd have a better conversation. They were wrong about that. They began, as you pointed out, withholding weapons that they think will stay Israel's ability to attack Rafah. Practically, they had no impact on whether or not Israel could attack Rafah because they had plenty of munitions to do that. But my understanding is that it did compromise two things. One, among the weapons that were withheld were something like 6,500 JDAMs, which turn dumb bombs into smart bombs. And by turning a dumb bomb into a smart bomb, you increase the ability of that smart bomb to be discriminate. So I don't like how you're fighting, so I'm going to prohibit you from being able to fight more discriminately. Doesn't make a lot of sense unless your effort there is to force Israel's hand to not actually attack because you think they won't be willing to absorb, the political cost of increased civilian casualties. Uh, but then the other problem is that Israel could supply, as I understood, its fight against Rafah by dipping into its reserve munitions. But those reserve munitions are reserved in case they have a larger conflict. And so it puts Israel in the precarious position, it puts our ally in the precarious position of fighting Rafah at the risk of maybe not being able to support a fight should Hezbollah attack, should Iran, do something else. So it jeopardized their security. So I think from the beginning, with the prospect of Israel's final assault on Rafah, the Biden administration has been misleading. They've been wrong, and some of their rhetoric has simply been dangerous. Some of their actions.
And how do you think that reflects an overall policy of appeasement in the region? You talked about Iran. What are like the real dangers of depleting Israel's reserves? That just seems so counter our own security interest in the region. What are potential externalities that could come from that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a little bit outside of my lane here, but I mean, the cascade effect. It seems to me. I mean, you could exercise your imagination in all sorts of directions. So if Israel appears weak, and if Israel is surrounded by neighbors that want to push it into the sea, then by depleting its ability to fight a larger scale multi-front war, you might invite that larger scale multi-front war. And then at that point, I don't think America would leave Israel to the wolves. We would jump in. And so now you've got, it just, you escalate the dangers. Yeah. And there's no need to do that, right? Israel, when it's powerful and when it's perceived as powerful, has a deterring effect against the ambitions of its, you know, uh, hateful neighbors. And you want to maintain that strength. You want to maintain that appearance of strength. You want to give everybody zero excuse to think that Israel is either alone or simply weaker. So you don't do that, and you signal, again, Kissinger's thing. There's all sorts of ways for the non-state actor to win, and you can't give them those means of winning. And part of it is just the political narrative. They need to know that there's a cost for things like October 7th, and the costs are going to be grave.
I'd love to circle back in closing to something you said about using force to root out radical ideologies. And obviously, the aim is to eliminate Hamas and delegitimize Hamas, but really reconstruction would come with, a generation's mindset change, and abandoning some of the really radical and poisonous ideas of Islamism. That's the root of Hamas's ideology. So what are some comparative historic examples? And you mentioned it's not just by force alone. So what are some of the other mechanisms used to root out ideologies such as Hamas?
Yeah, So great question. I mean, just to touch to reemphasize the force. World War One, I think, is a great example of the idea that one implication of just war morality is decisive victory. Right? Wars need to be fought to a decisive conclusion, and that doesn't necessarily need to be the kind of the full scale victory that America enjoyed over Japan. Our ambitions may be lesser, but whatever our war aim is, we need to fight with decisiveness appropriate to decisively achieving that particular aim. So if the aim is simply to get Assad to stop barrel bombing his people, then you use enough force that is decisive toward that end. You make it clear. Now, World War One, being a larger conflict, ends in an armistice, not a surrender. General Pershing, who was in charge of the American Expeditionary Force, begged, cajoled, pleaded with the Allies to not sign the armistice. He said, "Give me one more week." He wanted to march into Germany because he says the Germans do not know that they've been defeated. They've never been defeated in mass on the field. Their armies are intact. In fact, we have records of German generals telling their troops, "You are surrendering on enemy-occupied land. Go home with your heads held high." right? And so there was no sense that Germany had been defeated on the battlefield, which gave rise to this idea that they were stabbed in the back at home and all the rest. I think the young men, American and Brits, who fought World War One grew to be the middle-aged and older men who were fighting World War Two, and they learned their lesson, which is why we had an unconditional surrender demand of both Germany and Japan. To use Pershing's terms, they need to know they've been licked. And it's only when an enemy has been licked and the fight has been taken out of them that they are now in the mood for maybe reconciliation, right? And so you saw that over Germany and you saw that over Japan. Both were brought to decisive ends. And in the long run, those turned out to be acts of grace toward the enemy because it gave them permission to stand down. And so when I look at how do you eliminate ideologies, how do terrorist groups die? And there's multiple ways, right? There's all sorts of things, but I want to touch on one, which is you crush them, right? You bring them to a decisive end, and that can be done. Sri Lanka did it to the Tamil Tigers. Russia arguably did that in Chechnya. These things can be done. So decisive military victories are important. You take away their capacity to fight. You take away their will to fight. The deeper and probably better, longer term, more sustainable way is that you allow or help the terrorist group lose popular support. And so when we looked at Rafah, the idea was, one, you crush them militarily, Hamas, and then two, you take away their ability to be perceived as the dominant political force. And then not only do you do that, but you begin to lavish humanitarian goods on the Palestinian people. You bring in all sorts of infrastructure support. You rebuild them. You demonstrate to them that they do not need Hamas. And so you win over Palestinian support. Now, whether or not that can be done in this particular context is beyond me. But I'd say it's that 1-2 kind of effort where there is a decisive military victory. And then you try to thoroughly delegitimize the ideology within the popular mind. And that's something that presumably Israeli Jews can't fully do. It's going to require Palestinian Muslims. It's going to require the greater Middle East working together to demonstrate to the Palestinian people that they do not need a group like Hamas to live flourishing lives. I just picture myself as a Palestinian father, and what will it take for me to want to live in peace with Israel? And I can't quite think like a Palestinian dad. I get that, but I know some of the things that would allow me to want to live in peace with people that I've been at war with all my life.
Well, hopefully the vision for pluralism can be renewed as the conventional war draws to a close, which we don't know when that will be, but in the future. Marc, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. You gave us the tools to assess what's going on and also hope to look forward in the future as the war continues to play out. So I appreciate you coming on.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I do pray for the Palestinians. I do pray for the Israelis. This thing needs to be brought to an end.
Likewise. And where can our audience follow you and your work? Because you expand upon everything that we talked about in your writings.
Sure. They could look at providencemag.com. And then you could either, just Google me or not Google, but search within that database, my name or Hamas. I'm sure things will come up, but providencemag.com has been publishing a lot on this. And I've done some other things for World Opinions. You can Google me and Hamas and you'll find different things online. Maybe we can post some, if you guys do show notes or something, we could do something like that. So.
To your work. It's been very informative for myself as well. Thank you so much.
No, for sure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate the work you guys do. So best of luck with it.